the King of France is drowning. He is in full armor in a river he was not supposed to be near. On a day that was supposed to be a routine relief ride to a town under siege, and somewhere behind him, through the noise of collapsing timber and screaming horses and the cold shock of the water closing over him, he can hear the man responsible for this laughing. Philip II Augustus, King of France, master of the most sophisticated diplomatic machine in medieval Europe. The man who had spent 7 years systematically dismantling the Angevin Empire while its king was away on crusade is swallowing river water and being knocked back and forth by the armored bodies of his own drowning knights. While Richard, the First of England, stands on the bank watching and making jokes about how much Philip needed a drink after his hard ride. 20 French knights are going to die in this river today. 100 of the finest fighting men in Philip's army are about to surrender. And the King of France himself is going to be hauled out of the water, gasping and shivering, and hustled inside the nearest castle to spend the afternoon wrapped in a blanket, contemplating the specific catastrophe of nearly being drowned by a man he has been trying to destroy for a decade. This is the Battle of Gisors, 1198. And to understand how two kings who once went on crusade together ended up here, one laughing on the bank and one drowning in the river, you need to go back to the moment everything began to unravel. October 1192. And Richard I, King of England and Lord of the Angevin Empire, the vast collection of territories stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees that his family had built over generations, is crouched in the hold of a ship in the eastern Mediterranean, trying very hard not to be recognized. He has spent 3 years on crusade in the Holy Land, fighting Saladin to a standstill, recovering Jerusalem's supply routes, winning battles at Arsuf and Jaffa, performing feats of personal combat so extraordinary that Arab mothers were reportedly telling their children for generations afterward that the Lionheart was watching from the dark, and if they didn't behave, he would come for them. He has also spent 3 years making enemies. He threw the standard of Leopold of Austria off a wall at Acre into the dirt as a public humiliation. Leopold, who had fought beside him because Richard found the man's claim to equal glory in the campaign insulting and did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. He rejected Philip of France's sister for a bride and humiliated the French king publicly in the process. He was widely rumored, whether truthfully or not, to be connected to the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, a man whose election to the kingship of Jerusalem Richard had opposed. Every land route home is watched. Every sea route is watched. And the man they are watching for is not a fugitive or a criminal. He is one of the most famous warriors in Christendom, which makes hiding him somewhat more complicated than usual. He tries anyway, sailing up the Adriatic with 4 attendants, passing himself off as a returning Templar knight trying to reach the lands of his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion of Saxony, the one friend remaining to him on the continent. The winter sea destroys that plan. The ship wrecks at Istria, and after 3 days of riding overland in disguise, Richard is captured by Leopold of Austria. And while the greatest soldier in Europe sits in an Austrian castle writing poetry, his empire begins to burn. The man who lights the first fire is Richard's own brother, John. Within weeks of learning that Richard has been captured, John rides to the court of Philip of France and kneels before the French king and swears his loyalty and offers Philip everything Richard's lands in France. His claim to the throne, the hand of Alice, whom Richard had publicly rejected. and the effective surrender of the Angevin Empire to French overlordship in exchange for Philip's support of John's own ambitions. Philip accepts with the enthusiasm of a man who has spent years watching for exactly this opportunity. He moves immediately on Gisors, the great fortress at the meeting of three rivers that guards the approaches to Normandy, whose octagonal walls and cylindrical keep represent the single most formidable military structure in northern France, and whose loss would effectively open the heart of Richard's French territories to whatever Philip chose to do next. The castle's governor, Gilbert de Vascoil, surrenders it to Philip with a speed that leaves Richard's loyalists speechless with rage, because there is no military explanation for how quickly it falls, only political ones. And the political explanation is that someone has been paid or promised something, and the great bulwark of Normandy changes hands not through siege, but through treachery. Philip does not stop at Gisors. He moves through Normandy, burning what cannot be turned to profit, taking hostages in enormous numbers, pushing his army through the Vexin region all the way to Dieppe, and then south to put Rouen itself, Richard's ancestral Norman capital, under siege. John, meanwhile, is attempting to raise support in England for his own claim to the throne against the efforts of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is simultaneously managing the defense of the island and working to raise the ransom that will bring her son home. The ransom demanded by Emperor Henry, who has taken custody of Richard from Leopold, is 25% of England's annual income, a number so staggering that when Eleanor introduces the tax to raise it, the English population responds with the particular outrage of people being asked to pay for something they didn't cause and don't think is their problem. Philip and John both separately send bribes to Emperor Henry to keep Richard imprisoned longer. Both attempts fail because Richard has spent his captivity so impressively arguing his own case at an imperial trial in front of an audience of German nobles who were frankly not expecting to be impressed that the emperor's court has developed a considerable respect for the man in the cell and is disinclined to make his situation worse for French gold. Eventually, England pays, and in early 1194, Richard is released. And Philip writes John a letter with exactly 3 words of practical advice: look to yourself. Then he adds, the devil is loose. The devil lands at Sandwich on the Kent coast in March 1194, and his return to England is less a homecoming than a reckoning. Within weeks, Nottingham and Tickhill, the great fortresses that John had seized, are besieged and recovered. Every significant estate that had gone to his brother is taken back, and the men who had actively betrayed Richard during his captivity are hanged. Because Richard has no philosophical uncertainty about how traitors should be treated, and no patience for arguments about mercy toward people who tried to sell his kingdom while he was a prisoner. He appears before the people of Winchester in the finest clothes available, with his crown on, and the explicit intent to communicate through sheer visual spectacle that the captivity is expunged. The humiliation is over, and the king is back. He appoints Hubert Walter, another veteran of the crusade, loyal enough to have spent the captivity years working alongside Eleanor to raise the ransom as Archbishop of Canterbury and effective governor of England. Then in May, he sails for France at the head of an armada of 300 ships. John is waiting on the beach at Barfleur, and what he does when he sees his brother's fleet approaching tells you everything about John. As a man, he throws himself face down in the dirt and prostrates himself and begs forgiveness in the most complete physical display of submission available. Richard picks him up and hugs him and says, "You are a child, and you have had bad men looking after you. and those who gave you bad advice will get what they deserve. Many of the men around Richard find this inexplicable, because the list of what John has given away while Richard was gone is genuinely staggering. Gisors, the Vexin, Western Normandy, the coastal regions of Arques and Au Dieppe, fortresses in Touraine and Angoulême in Aquitaine, years of strategic work undone in months for the benefit of a brother who folded like wet parchment the moment the stronger sibling disappeared. But Richard forgives John and turns his full attention to the only enemy who actually matters, Philip Augustus, King of France, and the most dangerous politician in Europe. The campaign Richard launches in the summer of 1194 is a masterclass in the specific kind of warfare he had been refining his entire adult life: fast movement, overwhelming aggression, siege rather than pitched battle when possible, pitched battle when necessary, and the willingness to appear somewhere the enemy does not expect, before the enemy has finished deciding what to do about the last place Richard appeared. Philip has the town of Verneuil under siege when Richard arrives, and instead of waiting for Philip to finish or opening negotiations, Richard rides his army directly at the French position, threatening to besiege the besiegers from outside, a move so aggressive that Philip abandons the siege and rides away to punish John for massacring the French garrison at Evreux, leaving behind a detachment to continue the siege, which also decides to leave the next day when it considers the situation properly and abandons its siege artillery in the process. Richard takes the artillery and moves south toward Tours and the Loire Valley, and Philip sets off in pursuit, and the two armies spend the summer of 1194 in a chase across France that covers hundreds of miles without ever producing a decisive engagement, because Philip is not willing to commit to open battle against Richard, and Richard cannot quite pin Philip down long enough to force one. Then, at Fredeval Wood in July, Richard catches Philip's rearguard, and what he captures is not a military victory in any conventional sense, but something potentially more valuable than any single battle: Philip's entire royal baggage train, not just tents and supplies, the royal archives, every letter, every list of Philip's income, every military plan, every agreement, and crucially, every name of every spy in Richard's territories, and every noble who had been secretly bought by French gold while pretending to serve the Lionheart. Richard now knows everyone who has been working against him, has their names in writing, and has Philip's complete financial picture. Philip signs a truce on July 23rd that stops the immediate bleeding, but leaves him holding Gisors and significant territory in Normandy, and the underlying conflict has not been resolved. It has merely been paused while both kings build their next position. Richard's answer to losing Gisors is to make Gisors irrelevant. He finds a high, rocky outcrop above the town of Les Andelys, where the Seine curves through the Norman countryside, and he builds Castle Gaillard, the saucy castle, on a piece of ground so naturally defensible that military architects who see it describe it as almost impossibly strong, with the river covering one approach, the cliff covering another, and the castle's concentric walls covering everything else. The construction is entirely forbidden under the terms of his truce with Philip, which is precisely the point, because Castle Gaillard is not just a fortress. It is a declaration. It says that Richard's rule in France is not provisional, not subject to Philip's approval, not going anywhere. And if Philip wants to dispute that, he knows where to find the argument. Philip's response is to interpret the construction as a declaration of war, which is the correct interpretation. And war resumes almost immediately. The campaigns of 1196 and 1197 are grimmer than what came before. Years of continuous warfare have stripped away whatever restraints chivalric convention was supposed to impose on both sides. And the chronicles of this period describe things being done to civilian populations that make even contemporary writers uncomfortable. People whose homes are burned count themselves fortunate if what they lose is only property rather than eyes or limbs, or worse. Both armies are showing the accumulated brutality of too many years of campaigning. And the gap between the theoretical code of how knights were supposed to conduct war and how they were actually conducting it has become a chasm. Richard takes Courcel's chassis and Bori in 1198 and rides back to Dangu, 4 miles from Gisors itself. And the war that has been running since his captivity is approaching its final test. Philip receives a message telling him that Courcel's chassis is still holding out against Richard's forces, and its garrison is fighting hard. This information is wrong. What actually happened at Courcel's chassis is that Richard has already taken it, occupied it, and moved on. And the smoke rising from the neighborhood that Philip's force sees when it arrives is the smoke of a settlement already reduced and occupied, not a settlement currently under attack. But Philip doesn't know this when he rides out from his position, likely near or at Gisors itself, with several hundred knights toward the town, thinking he is going to relieve a garrison under pressure and catch Richard unawares in the middle of a fight. What he is actually riding into is the awareness of a man who has spent 30 years developing an instinct for exactly this kind of situation. Richard is patrolling the newly controlled territory around Courcel's when word reaches him that Philip is on the road and moving toward him. And he does not deliberate or send for additional forces or form a committee to discuss tactical options. He turns his horse in Philip's direction and rides. Philip and his knights arrive before Courcel's and find smoke and silence and the specific kind of quiet that means the people who were supposed to be there are gone, and the people who should not be there already are. The realization arrives fast. He has ridden into the wrong situation, with the wrong number of men, without artillery or the means to dig in. And the crossbow bolts that start coming from the tree lines at that moment confirm what his instincts have already told him. He turns his force around to withdraw. Then Richard's cavalry becomes visible. The dilemma Philip faces in the next 30 seconds is the specific medieval dilemma of a king who values his personal honor and also very much values his personal survival. And when those two things pull in opposite directions simultaneously, there is no good answer available. Honor requires a king to stand and face another king in the field. But Philip has a few hundred knights, and Richard has more. And Richard's force is already moving at speed with the focused intent of men who want to put their hands on the King of France and drag him before the Lionheart in chains. Philip makes the only rational decision available. He runs. What follows is not a battle in any conventional sense. It is a chase across the Norman countryside, with everything that matters in French politics at stake. Because a captured Philip means a ransom that could bankrupt the French kingdom. Means the release of every strategic secret Philip has been building for a decade. Means the complete reversal of every advantage he has worked for since Richard's captivity. Richard himself is in the chase, personally unhorsing knights. As he rides, he will boast later that he managed 3 with a single lance, and his mercenary captain, Mercadier, is keeping fresh horses coming to the king, so that nothing as mundane as an exhausted animal slows the pursuit. Every French knight whose horse stumbles or hits a divot in the road is immediately surrounded and told to yield, and the ones who don't yield are killed. and small skirmishes break out all along the route as Richard's faster-moving force overtakes individual French riders, while the bulk of Philip's cavalry is still ahead, trying to reach the one place in this part of Normandy that can actually protect them. Gisors. The great fortress whose loss had started this entire sequence of events, the castle that had surrendered to Philip through treachery in 1193. The structure that Richard had replaced with Castle Gaillard precisely because he could not trust it anymore. Gisors is now Philip's salvation, and he can see its towers through the dust ahead of him. And he is riding with everything his horse has left toward the bridge across the Epte. Richard has placed ambush forces at several of the river crossing points, anticipating exactly this move. But Philip takes a route Richard did not fully cover, and the French king, with his guard tied around him, reaches the bridge and rides onto it. Philip is on the bridge. His guard clusters around him on the narrow causeway, and more riders come up from behind, pressing onto the structure from the French side. And Richard's cavalry is still coming hard from the rear, with no intention of breaking off the chase, even with the fortress walls above and the river below. And then the bridge collapses. The weight of armored knights, armored horses, and the collective mass of a panicked cavalry force pressing onto a medieval bridge that was not designed for this specific load reaches whatever the bridge's limit was. And the timber gives and the stone shifts. And suddenly the King of France and 20 of his finest knights and scores of horses are in the river. Philip, in full armor, goes under. Medieval armor in deep, fast water is not a survivable situation. Under normal circumstances, the weight pulls you down, and the current takes you, and the disorientation of cold water and darkness, and the bodies of your own drowning companions. Crashing into you makes it almost impossible to find which way is up, let alone which way is the bank. He is swallowing water at what the chroniclers describe as an alarming rate, and the steel forms of his knights and their horses are battering him back and forth in the current. And on both sides of the destroyed bridge, there is frantic shouting and movement as the French try to reach their king before the river finishes what Richard started. Richard stands on his side of the river and watches. He is reported to have turned to his companions, Mercader among them, and William Marshall, who recorded this scene in his biography and remarked that Philip was getting a good drink after his hard ride. They get Philip out. Somehow, in the chaos of the collapsed bridge and the drowning knights and the screaming horses, someone reaches him, and he is pushed and hauled toward the bank and pulled out of the water gasping and shivering. And he is hustled inside Gisors under the protection of the battlements above, and the gates close, and he is left to recover in whatever warmth the garrison can provide, while the river takes the 20 knights who were less fortunate. The accounting that William Marshall makes of the day is precise and devastating in the way that a careful man writing down facts he personally witnessed tends to be. 20 knights drowned in the river beside Philip. 100 great men captured by Richard's force, including several of the highest rank in the French military. 200 French knights lost their horses in the chase, and of those 200 horses, 140 were armored more expensively than the majority of Richard's own cavalry. Richard's personal tally from the engagement, the 3 knights unhorsed with a single lance, is small against that larger number. But the king writes about it in letters with the particular glee of a man who cannot quite believe how well the day went. The French chroniclers of this period are faced with the specific historiographical problem of writing about an event that is both completely documented and catastrophically embarrassing for the monarchy they serve. and what they produce is a masterpiece of strategic omission, acknowledging the engagement without quite capturing its full dimensions, and certainly not dwelling on the image of their king being fished out of a river, while the man who put him there made jokes on the bank. After Gisors, both kings have enough. Philip has his life and his kingdom still technically intact, but the accumulated damage of the 1198 campaign, the loss of Courcelles, the loss of so many knights, the humiliation of the bridge and the river and the laughter has made further aggressive action inadvisable, and Richard has demonstrated so comprehensively that he is the superior soldier that the case for another campaign season needs more political foundation than Philip currently has. They meet in January 1199. And the meeting is conducted with the specific choreography of two men who have been trying to destroy each other for years and are not quite ready to stop, but are willing to pause. Richard stands on the deck of a boat on the Seine, and Philip stands on the bank, and they shout at each other. And both sides describe this as negotiations. A 5-year truce is agreed. Richard has by this point recovered essentially everything taken from him during his captivity, the lands, the castles, the political position, and has demonstrated through the campaigns of 1194 to 1198 that no French military campaign on his territories will go unanswered, and that the answering will consistently go badly for France. He turns his attention south to what appear to be easier problems: restless lords in Limoges and Angoulême, minor rebellions that need suppressing, small castles that need reducing the kind of routine work that fills the spaces between major campaigns. One of those castles is at a place called Chalice. It is reportedly defended by 40 men. Richard looks forward to an easy spring. He does not know that a crossbow bolt loosed from those walls will hit him in the shoulder, and that the wound will fester, and that Gaius Claudius Nero, who saved Rome by disobeying orders, would have recognized the bitter irony that the man who survived the Third Crusade survived Austrian captivity, survived 7 years of war against the most politically sophisticated king in Europe, would be killed by 40 men at a castle nobody had heard of. But that ending has not happened yet. In January 1199, Richard I stands on a boat in the Seine and shouts at Philip Augustus, and everything is still in God's hands. The Battle of Gisors is not in most history books in the way that Agincourt or Crécy are, and the reason is partly that it is not quite a battle in the formal sense. No formation charges, no arranged lines, no heralds exchanging terms before the fighting begins. Just a pursuit, a collapse, and a river. But what it represents is the definitive statement of the Richard-Philip rivalry, and what that rivalry tells us about how the medieval world actually worked beneath the layer of chivalric ceremony that the chroniclers preferred to describe. These were two men who had gone on crusade together, who had been allies before they were enemies, who had shared the extraordinary experience of campaigning in the Holy Land, and who had come back transformed by that experience in different ways. Richard into the finest pure soldier of his age, and Philip into the finest pure strategist of his age. And the result of putting those two men in competition for the same territory over a decade is exactly what you would expect, a conflict that never fully resolved, because neither man could quite deliver the decisive blow against the too fair other's specific strength. Philip could not beat Richard in the field. Richard could not beat Philip at a table. And so they circled each other for years, burning each other's territories, capturing each other's castles, bribing each other's nobles, until the river at Gisors produced the closest thing to a verdict the rivalry would ever reach. One man laughing on the bank and one man drowning in the current, and 20 knights going to the bottom with the armor that was supposed to protect them. The medieval world is full of battles fought between men who have forgotten what they were fighting about and remembered only that they were supposed to be enemies. The Richard Philip rivalry is not one of them. They knew exactly what they wanted. They knew exactly why they wanted it. And at Gisors in September 1198, the river gave its verdict. Richard won. If you want to know how the medieval world actually functioned, not the sanitized version with noble knights in shining armor, but the real version with drowned kings and burning towns and men who rode 500 kilometers to deliver a severed head and laughed when their enemies fell into rivers, then this channel exists for exactly that reason. Battle Archive is where the history that actually explains the world gets told the way it deserves to be told, without the ceremony, without the flattery, without the parts that make the losers look better than they were. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with someone who thinks they know Richard the Lionheart, because I promise you they have never heard about the afternoon Philip Augustus spent being fished out of the Epte while Richard made jokes on the bank. The next story is already waiting, and it is just as insane as this one.